Working Thanksgiving night wasn't something I had planned for in 2019, but bills don't pay themselves. The diner where I worked was a small, 24-hour joint just off a stretch of empty highway in rural Minnesota. Most of our customers at that hour were truckers grabbing coffee to keep awake, or the occasional local too tired to cook. That night was quiet, even for a holiday. By 2 a.m., I'd only served 2 people, a trucker who tipped with quarters and a guy who left a pile of breadcrumbs on the counter. The hum of the overhead fluorescent lights and the occasional crackle of the radio were my only company. It was during one of those quiet moments, while I wiped down the counter, that I saw them walk in. The couple looked off. They were elderly, maybe late 70s or early 80s, and both were dressed like they were on their way to a Thanksgiving dinner in another decade. The man wore a sharp gray suit with a thin black tie, and the woman had on a pastel dress with a pearl necklace. The clothes weren't costumes. They looked authentic, like they'd been pulled straight from the 1950s. The pair smiled as they approached the counter, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes. Something about the way they moved, so slow, made me pause. "Good evening," the man said in a voice that was deep but distant, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "We'll have 2 turkey dinners, please." I glanced at the menu above the counter, even though I didn't need to. We didn't serve turkey dinners, not on Thanksgiving or any other day. We don't have turkey," I said hesitantly. "I can do sandwiches, maybe some pie." "No," the woman interrupted, her smile widening. 2 turkey dinners." Her voice was light, almost musical, but it made the hairs on my arms stand up. Before I could say anything else, the man reached into his pocket and placed a crisp $20 bill on the counter. The bill looked brand new, but it was the old design, the kind you'd find in a collector's album. "I'll see what I can do," I said. I retreated to the kitchen, though I had no intention of cooking anything. I just needed a moment to gather myself. Something about them felt not threatening exactly, but wrong in a way I couldn't explain. When I came back out, they were seated at one of the booths near the window, perfectly still. Their backs were straight, hands folded neatly in their laps, eyes fixed on me. I brought them 2 plates of what I could cobble together: slices of turkey from a leftover sandwich tray, reheated mashed potatoes, and canned green beans. They didn't touch the food. For nearly half an hour, they sat there, staring at me. Not at each other, not at the food, just me. Their smiles never wavered, and I found myself avoiding their gaze, focusing on wiping down the same spot on the counter over and over. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the coffee pot and walked over to their table. "Can I get you anything else?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Neither of them spoke. The woman tilted her head ever so slightly, her eyes unblinking. The man's smile stretched unnaturally wide. I backed away and returned to the counter, pretending to check the register. When I looked up again, the booth was empty. The plates were still there, untouched, but they were gone. The bell above the door hadn't rung, and I hadn't heard their footsteps. I walked over to the booth, half expecting to see them crouched under the table, playing some kind of bizarre prank. But the only thing on the table besides the plates was a photograph. It was black and white, slightly faded, and showed the diner as it must have looked decades ago. The walls were cleaner, the furniture newer, but it was unmistakably the same place. In the foreground of the photo stood the same elderly couple, only younger. They weren't smiling in the photo. They were lying on the floor, eyes wide open, faces frozen in terror. A dark stain spread across the tile beneath them, and a man with a gun was standing near the cash register. I stared at the photo, trying to make sense of it. My hands felt cold, and the room seemed to close in around me. When I finally looked back up, the plates on the table were gone. So was the photograph. I quit the diner a week later. I told myself it was because the hours were too long or the pay wasn't worth it, but deep down, I knew the real reason. I didn't want to be there the next time they came back. I moved into my new apartment in Seattle in early 2018. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. By Thanksgiving, I felt settled enough to host dinner for my extended family. The apartment was small, but cozy enough to fit everyone around the table for a late-night meal. That evening, the place was alive with chatter and laughter. My aunt kept complimenting the stuffing. My cousin brought a pie that disappeared in minutes. Even my grandmother, who rarely left her house, showed up and stayed longer than I expected. By the time everyone left, it was nearly midnight. The quiet that followed was almost jarring. The only sounds were the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak from the old hardwood floor as I moved around. I started cleaning up, piling plates and cups into the sink, when I heard something that stopped me cold. It was the faint clink of a fork against a plate. I froze, holding my breath. For a moment, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had left a fork balanced precariously, and it finally fell. I turned back to the sink, trying to focus on the dishes, but then I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just a clink, it was the unmistakable sound of someone chewing. My stomach sank as I turned toward the dining table. There, at the far end, sat a woman. I hadn't noticed her during dinner. She wasn't part of my family. I didn't recognize her at all. Her hair was stringy and dark, hanging limply around her face. She wore an old-fashioned blouse with lace at the collar, the kind you'd expect to see in sepia-toned photos, not at a Thanksgiving dinner in 2018. She was picking at the leftover turkey with her hands, eating slowly. The room felt colder than before, and the air seemed heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. I cleared my throat, trying to mask the tremor in my voice. "I'm sorry, who are you?" She didn't look up right away. Her fingers paused mid-motion, hovering over the plate, and then she slowly raised her head. Her face. I don't know how to describe it. The skin was warped, as if it had melted and then hardened again. One eye drooped slightly, and the other seemed to look through me, not at me. Her mouth twisted into a faint, crooked smile. "I used to live here," she said, her voice raspy, barely above a whisper. "Before the fire, I tried to think, but my mind was blank. I hadn't heard anything about a fire when I moved in." She tilted her head, as if amused by my confusion. "I'm just so hungry," she murmured, picking up another piece of turkey. I stepped back. The woman didn't move, but her eyes followed me. "I think you should go," I stammered. "You're not supposed to be here." She let out a low chuckle, soft but chilling, and said nothing. I turned and bolted for the front door, yanking it open and running into the hallway. My upstairs neighbor, an older man named Phil, poked his head out of his apartment, startled by the noise. "There's someone in my apartment," I blurted. Phil frowned. "I just came down from the roof." I didn't see anyone come in. We both went back together. My heart thudded in my chest as I unlocked the door and pushed it open, expecting to see the woman still sitting at the table. The apartment was empty. The plate she'd been eating from was still there, though. The turkey was untouched, just as I'd left it before I started cleaning. Phil muttered something about stress and suggested I get some rest. I nodded absent-mindedly, too shaken to argue. Later that night, unable to sleep, I pulled up the building's history online. It didn't take long to find it. There had been a fire in the apartment building back in the 1970s. An electrical fault in what was now my unit had caused it. 4 people died, including a woman named Margaret, who was known to live alone and was, according to reports, badly burned in the blaze. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, a trick my mind played on me after a long day. But the next morning, when I checked the security footage from the hallway cameras, the truth became harder to deny. The recording showed me setting the table, welcoming my family, and later walking everyone to the door. But when the footage skipped to the time I heard the noises, there was no one at the table. The camera showed me standing there, staring at an empty chair, talking to no one. But what chilled me most was how the footage ended. As I ran out into the hallway to get Phil, the camera glitched. Just for a split second, there was static, and in that static, a figure, burned and twisted, seemed to flicker in the corner of the frame. I haven't hosted Thanksgiving since. It felt strange stepping back into the old house after all these years. The place hadn't changed much. Same creaky floors, same wallpaper peeling at the edges. It was like the house had been frozen in time since the night my parents disappeared. I hadn't come back out of nostalgia. I was here to sell the property. Vermont winters weren't kind to an empty house, and the realtor warned me that the longer it sat, the more repairs I'd have to deal with. It had been 15 years since I last stood in that living room. My parents vanished when I was 16. One minute they were hosting Thanksgiving dinner, and the next they were just gone. No note, no clues, nothing. The police found no sign of foul play, but their investigation didn't turn up anything else either. People whispered theories. Some said they ran off, others murmured about foul play. I didn't have an answer. I spent the rest of my teenage years with my aunt in Boston, trying not to think about it. But now I was back, walking through the house with a garbage bag in one hand, tossing out old junk. The memories felt like ghosts themselves, lurking in every corner. The basement was the worst. It always had a strange, damp smell, like the earth was creeping in. The single light bulb overhead cast long, flickering shadows on the concrete walls. I was rummaging through some boxes when I found it, a dusty tape recorder buried under a stack of old newspapers. I nearly threw it in the trash, but something about it felt off. The tape inside was labeled with a date, November 23rd, 2006, the day my parents disappeared. My fingers trembled as I pressed play. "Mark, if you're hearing this, it means something has happened to us." My father's voice was clear but strained, like he was forcing himself to stay calm. "Whatever you do, don't dig in the garden," my mother added, her voice cracking. "What's buried there isn't what it seems." We had to contain it. "Don't let it out." The recording cut off abruptly. I sat there in stunned silence, the words echoing in my head. My parents were always gardeners. Our backyard was filled with flower beds and rows of vegetables. But I never thought there was anything unusual about it. That night, the old house creaked and groaned like it was alive, every sound amplified by the silence. Around midnight, I heard it, scratching. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a tree branch brushing against the side of the house. But then I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the backyard. I stood by the window, staring at the snow-covered garden. The scratching was faint but steady, like something, or someone, was trying to claw their way out. I told myself to stay inside, but the sound wouldn't stop. It was relentless, burrowing into my brain. I grabbed a flashlight and went out into the freezing night. The garden looked normal at first, just rows of frostbitten plants. But then I saw it, a patch of disturbed earth near the center of the yard. The snow had been pushed aside, and the soil looked like it had been clawed at from underneath. The scratching grew louder as I approached. My breath came out in short, visible puffs as I knelt by the disturbed ground. I didn't even realize I had started digging until my hands hit something solid. It was a wooden box, about the size of a small chest. The wood was dark and rotting, and the hinges were rusted shut. I should have stopped there. I should have walked away, but I couldn't. I forced the box open, and the smell hit me first, a sickly metallic stench that made my stomach churn. Inside was something wrapped in a decayed burlap sack. I reached out, hesitating for just a moment before pulling the sack open. What I saw inside, I can't explain it. It looked human at first, a shriveled, withered thing curled up like a fetus. But its eyes were open, milky and glassy, staring straight at me. Its fingers were too long, ending in sharp, blackened nails. And then it moved. The thing let out a low, guttural sound, like air escaping from a broken pipe. Before I could react, it lashed out, grabbing my wrist with its clawed hand. I screamed and stumbled back, falling onto the frozen ground. The thing pulled itself out of the box, its limbs unfolding in unnatural, jerky movements. It was tall, too tall, and impossibly thin, its skin stretched tight over its bones. I ran. I don't remember how I got back into the house, but I locked every door and window behind me. I could hear it outside, scratching at the walls, tapping on the glass. The tape recorder was still in the basement. I grabbed it and pressed play again, desperate for answers. "If it ever gets out," my father's voice crackled through the speaker. "God help you. Don't let it leave the property." No matter what, I spent the rest of the night barricaded in the basement, clutching a crowbar and waiting for the scratching to stop. By morning, the house was silent. I ventured outside, my legs trembling with every step. The garden was untouched, the snow pristine. There was no sign of the box, or the thing that had been inside it. I didn't stick around to find out what happened. I left Vermont that day and never looked back. The house was sold to a developer who planned to tear it down. Sometimes I wonder if that was enough. If it's still there, buried beneath the rubble,
subscribe for
or if it's
more
out there somewhere
stories.
looking for me.